Judge Edward Chen entered the courtroom poised to discredit Pam Bondi, but within moments, the gavel came down on him instead. What unfolded next left every onlooker dumbfounded. The federal courthouse in the heart of downtown San Diego pulsed with tension that sticky Tuesday morning. Reporters elbowed for space in the crowded gallery, laptops teetering on their knees, pens at the ready. The day's proceedings had drawn widespread media interest, not merely for the headline-grabbing corruption trial at hand, but because Pam Bondi, Florida's former attorney general, was set to square off against the notoriously unsparing Judge Edward Chen. Chen swept into the courtroom on the dot of 9 a.m., his judicial robes trailing behind him like gathering storm clouds. At 58, he bore the upright rigidity of a man certain of his authority. Wire-framed glasses clung to a sharply defined nose, and his thin lips held a permanent air of displeasure. "All rise," intoned the bailiff, his voice slicing through the murmurs and bringing instant silence. As the hearing commenced, Pam Bondi approached the podium, impeccably dressed in a navy suit cut with precision. Before she could utter a word, Judge Chen's voice sliced through the air like a whip. "Ms. Bondi, I see you're leading the defense today. I must admit I'm surprised you've taken on a matter of this complexity, considering your past record." His tone made the remark sting. Bondi's expression remained unreadable, her golden hair framing a face schooled into practiced calm. "Good morning, Your Honor." "Yes, I am representing the defense," she replied evenly. Chen rifled through the stack of papers before him, refusing even a glance in her direction. "Let's hope your preparation exceeds what we saw during your last visit to my courtroom. We wouldn't want a repeat of that debacle." A quiet ripple passed through the observers. Many remembered that prior case, how Chen had repeatedly cut her off mid-argument and dismissed almost every motion she submitted. What few realized was that Bondi had spent the last 6 months meticulously preparing for this very encounter. "I can assure you, Your Honor, I am thoroughly prepared," she responded, her southern drawl slightly more pronounced, a subtle signal to those who knew her well that she was reining in her irritation. For nearly 40 minutes, Judge Chen's tone remained combative, his questions dripping with disdain. He gave the prosecution wide berth while clamping down on Bondi's responses. Each time she began to find her rhythm, he interrupted, belittled, or outright dismissed her reasoning. From the gallery, veteran legal correspondents exchanged uneasy glances. Chen's behavior had shifted from stern to overtly biased. A few jurors shifted in their chairs, visibly uneasy at the disparity on display. Bondi, however, held fast. While many in her position might have faltered under such scrutiny, she parried each verbal strike with dignified firmness. Now and then, she jotted a note in the margins of a yellow legal pad, not the frantic scribbles of someone scrambling to keep up, but the calm, intentional notes of a tactician charting her next move. As the morning drew to a close, Chen peered down over his spectacles. "We'll break for lunch, Miss Bondi. I suggest you take this time to reassess your approach. At the rate we're going, your client may wish to entertain a plea arrangement." Several on the prosecution bench grinned openly. Bondi simply collected her materials with measured grace. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice resonant enough to carry across the room. "I look forward to resuming this afternoon." Chen failed to notice the thick manila folder her co-counsel slid quietly onto the defense table, stamped with federal insignia, and most certainly absent when court began. Nor did he register the tall woman who had taken a seat in the back row during the hearing, her Justice Department credentials plainly displayed on a lanyard. A reckoning was brewing, but cloaked in his arrogance, Judge Edward Chen saw only clear skies. When the court reconvened after lunch, the room's atmosphere had grown weightier, thick with quiet expectancy. Judge Chen resumed his seat with the same imperious air, but now, his disdain carried the flavor of theater. The gallery had swelled, word of the morning's tense exchanges having spread like wildfire. "Ms. Bondi," Chen began abruptly, "I've had a look at your submissions over the break. I must confess, your interpretation of precedent is unusual. Perhaps you'd care to illuminate us?" A few prosecution attorneys snickered. One leaned toward a colleague to whisper something, prompting a stifled laugh. Bondi rose, smoothing her blazer with the ease of someone well aware all eyes were on her. I'd be glad to, Your Honor. The legal precedent set in Ronald v. Jason clearly supports our claim. Ronald v. Jason? Chen interrupted, his tone dripping with mockery. Truly, Miss Bondi? That decision was eviscerated by the Ninth Circuit just last year. One would think a former Attorney General would stay current on such developments. Except, Chen was wrong. He had confused the case with Harris v. Millbrook, a different matter entirely. The error was glaring to any practiced legal mind in the room. But before Bondi could correct him, he was already mid-tirade, determined to continue her public rebuke. Judge Edward Chen entered the courtroom with the quiet swagger of a man intent on publicly shaming Pam Bondi, yet within moments, the tables turned, and the hammer of justice came down not on her, but on him. What unfolded next left the courtroom breathless with shock. The federal courthouse in the heart of downtown Savannah thrummed with suspense on that sticky Tuesday morning. Reporters jostled elbow to elbow in the crowded gallery, balancing laptops on crossed legs, pens poised above notepads. Today's hearing had drawn national scrutiny, not merely for the prominent corruption trial on the schedule, but because Florida's former Attorney General, Pam Bondi, was set to challenge Judge Edward Chen, a figure known for his iron-fisted authority and razor-sharp tongue. Judge Chen entered precisely at 9 a.m., his flowing black robe trailing like thunderclouds behind him. At 58, he bore the rigid, unbending carriage of a man who considered himself above reproach. Wire-framed glasses rested on his sharply hooked nose, and his lips, perpetually pursed, seemed sculpted from scorn. "All rise," boomed the bailiff, his voice slicing through the tense silence. The proceedings commenced as Pam Bondi stepped forward, composed and poised in a finely cut navy ensemble. Before she could utter a word, Judge Chen's voice split the air like a whip. "Ms. Bondi, representing the defense today, are you? I must confess, I'm surprised you've elected to involve yourself in such a nuanced matter, given your record." His inflection turned the remark into a veiled slight. Bondi's expression remained imperturbable, her golden hair framing a visage unreadable as stone. "Good morning, Your Honor." "Yes, I am lead counsel for the defense." Chen sifted through his stack of papers, not bothering to meet her gaze. "Let's hope you've come better prepared than during your last appearance in this courtroom. I trust we won't witness another regrettable display." A hushed wave of unease rippled through the gallery. Those in attendance remembered well the previous case in which Chen had frequently overruled Bondi and dismissed her motions with little more than contempt. What they couldn't know was that Bondi had spent the last 6 months readying herself for this exact confrontation. "I can assure the court, Your Honor, I am thoroughly prepared," she said, her southern cadence a touch more pronounced, a subtle signal to those who knew her that she was reining in her temper. For the next 40 minutes, Chen's antagonism did not abate. He questioned her every assertion with barely concealed derision, granting the prosecution wide latitude while confining Bondi's arguments within strict bounds. Each time she gathered momentum, he found a way to stall or derail her progress. Veteran journalists exchanged glances in the gallery. Chen's behavior had slipped from stern into the realm of inappropriate. A few jurors shifted in their seats, visibly uneasy at the imbalance. Still, Bondi never faltered. Where others might have buckled under such ceaseless pressure, she responded with unfailing courtesy and assertiveness. Those familiar with her methods noticed the measured way she scribbled notes on a yellow legal pad, not the panicked flurry of someone drowning, but the deliberate tracking of someone biding her time. As the morning drew to a close, Chen peered down at Bondi over the edge of his glasses. "We'll break for lunch, Miss Bondi. I suggest you use the intermission to reconsider your defense. At this pace, your client may want to explore a plea bargain." A few members of the prosecution grinned smugly. Bondi, unruffled, gathered her documents with meticulous grace. "Thank you, Your Honor," she replied, her voice resonant and calm, filling the chamber with quiet authority. "I look forward to resuming this afternoon." As Chen exited, he failed to notice Bondi's co-counsel slide a thick, official-looking manila folder onto the defense table, one marked with federal insignia that had not been present earlier. Nor did he see the tall, stern-eyed woman who had slipped into the back row, a Department of Justice badge swinging lightly from a lanyard at her chest. A storm was brewing, but in his hubris, Judge Edward Chen remained blind to the gathering clouds. When the court reconvened after the recess, the very air felt denser, charged with unspoken electricity. Chen took his seat again, exuding the same pompous confidence, but now his scorn had acquired a theatrical flair. The gallery had grown since morning, whispers of the intense exchange had drawn an even larger crowd. "Ms. Bondi," Chen intoned without preamble. "I've reviewed your submissions over lunch. I must confess, your interpretation of case law is rather inventive. Please, enlighten us with your peculiar understanding of legal precedent." Laughter rippled quietly from the prosecution's side. One attorney leaned over to share a quip with a colleague, who stifled a giggle behind her hand. Bondi rose, straightening her blazer. "I'd be glad to, Your Honor. The decision in Ronald v. Jason directly supports our argument." "Ronald v. Jason?" Chen sneered, interrupting her. "Really, Miss Bondi? That ruling was effectively nullified by the 11th Circuit last year. I'd expect a former Attorney General to stay current with legal developments." Except Chen was mistaken. He had confused the case with Harris v. Millbrook, an entirely separate matter. Any sharp-eyed legal mind in the room could see the blunder. Yet before Bondi could interject, Chen pressed on, continuing his public reprimand. "Perhaps in Georgia, the threshold for legal argumentation is a touch more elastic," Judge Chen remarked, eliciting another round of poorly masked laughter, "but in this courtroom, I expect counsel to bring more than charisma and political favor to the table." Fingers flew across keyboards as reporters chronicled each inflammatory syllable. In the jury box, expressions shifted, from discomfort to outright disapproval. The judge's sarcasm, now untempered, reverberated like a low thunderclap. "Your Honor," Bondi responded with even composure, "if I could refer the court to the supplemental brief filed earlier. Page 17 clarifies the legal distinction between Ronald v. Jason and the case I believe you're referencing." Judge Chen waved a dismissive hand, his disdain palpable. "Miss Bondi, I've worn these robes for 22 years. I don't require a primer on jurisprudence from someone whose legal resume reads more like a media tour than a casebook." This time, the derision was so blatant that even some of the prosecution attorneys shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable. At the rear of the courtroom, the Department of Justice observer now scribbled notes with rapid, unrelenting focus. Throughout the verbal barrage, Bondi remained an emblem of poise. Her tone never wavered, her expression betrayed nothing. With quiet discipline, she recorded each inappropriate comment and procedural breach. Her yellow legal pad now resembled a meticulous ledger of judicial impropriety, the kind that appellate courts do not easily ignore. "Your Honor," she said after an especially scathing remark, "may I request that my formal objection to the court's characterization be entered into the record?" "Note whatever you please, Miss Bondi. It won't alter the feebleness of your case." Chen swept his gaze across the courtroom, his expression one of smug theatricality, clearly aware of the crowd watching his every word. "In my experience," he added, "when attorneys begin to object to the court's demeanor, it's usually because they've exhausted their actual arguments." Soft chuckles, furtive glances. Yet beneath the surface, the tide was shifting, the earlier jeers giving way to quiet sympathy for Bondi, and a growing sense of unease with the judge's conduct. During a sidebar conference with both counsels, Chen leaned slightly toward Bondi, his voice low, but audible to those nearby. "You're floundering here, counselor. Always have been. And in my courtroom, reputations don't carry verdicts." As the attorneys returned to their tables, Bondi's co-counsel slid a slim document toward her. She glanced at it, nodded subtly, and slipped it into her folio. Chen, caught in the echo chamber of his own arrogance, missed the moment entirely. The court reporter's hands moved with lightning speed across her stenotype, capturing not only the language but the unmistakable tone of a judge who had stepped far beyond the boundaries of decorum. And in the back, the court sketch artist committed to paper a scene that would soon saturate news cycles across the country: Judge Edward Chen, a portrait of haughty disdain, towering over Pam Bondi, whose face remained serene, belying the storm she was about to unleash. 3 hours into the afternoon session, the judge's contempt had become a grimly predictable routine. Each of Bondi's arguments met with yet another interruption or rebuke. A weight of tedium settled over the courtroom until Bondi finally rose, her posture straight, her voice carrying a new, unmistakable edge. "Your Honor," she began, "before I proceed with our defense, I must address several procedural irregularities that have emerged during today's proceedings." Chen sighed dramatically. "Miss Bondi, we've squandered enough time on your procedural grievances, unless they're of substance." "They are, Your Honor," she said, cutting him off, for the first time that day. The interruption sent a ripple of surprise through the gallery. "I'd like to bring the court's attention to Judicial Canon 2A, which mandates that a judge must uphold and adhere to the law, and conduct himself in a manner that fosters public trust in the impartiality and integrity of the judiciary." A shadow crossed Chen's face. "Are you accusing this court of ethical violations, Counselor?" "I am not insinuating it, Your Honor. I am formally submitting into the record." Gasps from the prosecution side. The bombshell was clearly unexpected. And what, precisely, did this surveillance uncover with respect to the present trial? Bondi asked. Her investigator, Rivera, stepped forward, removing a document from his brief. "We have verified records of 7 distinct meetings between Judge Chen and Mr. Joshua Murphy, CEO of Kestrel Technologies, the chief corporate entity poised to gain should the defendant in this case be convicted." Bondi moved to the evidence trolley and extracted a thick binder. "Your Honor, I am submitting as evidence the full transcripts of recorded discussions between yourself and Mr. Harrington, wherein you refer, verbatim, to ensuring the appropriate outcome in this matter." She distributed copies to the clerk, the prosecution, and laid one squarely before the judge. Chen's face, once flushed with derision, now paled to the color of ash. "Furthermore," she continued, her tone steady and resolute, "we have traced a series of sizable wire transfers to an offshore account connected to Your Honor, each transaction occurring within 48 hours of rulings that notably favored Kestrel Technologies and its subsidiaries." The lead prosecutor bolted to his feet, his chair clattering behind him. "Your Honor, the prosecution was wholly unaware of these allegations. We respectfully request an immediate sidebar." For a long, breathless moment, Judge Chen appeared frozen, his eyes transfixed on the financial documents now circulating throughout the courtroom. Wire transfers, bank records, and an intricate web of shell corporations unraveled in a trail that led unmistakably to his private chambers. At the rear of the room, the Department of Justice observer had been joined by 3 additional figures, each marked by the discreet earpieces and unreadable expressions of federal enforcement. Their silent scrutiny intensified the tension that clung to the air like static before a lightning strike. "Moreover," Bondi said, her voice crystalline in the heavy hush, "we have credible evidence that Your Honor deliberately withheld exculpatory material in 3 previous criminal proceedings, each of which ended in wrongful convictions that financially enriched Kestrel Technologies and its subsidiaries." She gestured toward her co-counsel, who activated a laptop connected to the courtroom's projection system. Instantly, a series of email correspondences flickered onto the screen, unambiguous and damning. They revealed a cascade of communication that could only be interpreted as judicial misconduct of the gravest nature. "These communications," Bondi continued, addressing both the bench and the stunned gallery, "were acquired under lawfully issued federal warrants as part of an active investigation into public corruption." Jurors who had been cautiously attentive were now riveted. A woman in the front row, elderly, with silver hair and a granite expression, shook her head slowly, as if watching the last sliver of faith in the system slip away. Judge Chen finally spoke, though the command that once girded his voice had crumbled. This is absurd. These accusations have been fully documented, independently verified, and corroborated by multiple entities," Bondi replied, finishing his sentence with surgical precision. "And that's not all, Your Honor." She nodded toward Agent Rivera, who stepped forward with a sealed envelope and handed it to the clerk. "This is a formal request from the U.S. Department of Justice," she announced, "for an emergency suspension of these proceedings, pending an inquiry into allegations of judicial corruption." The courtroom was utterly still as the envelope was delivered to Chen. His hands, once steady with authority, now trembled as he tore it open. It was as if the very air refused to move, waiting for the unraveling to continue. As his eyes scanned the contents, the pallor of his face deepened to a blotchy crimson, rising up his neck like a fever. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, reaching instinctively for the gavel, as if the weight of its oak handle might restore the crumbling illusion of control. Such claims should have followed the proper procedural channels, not been theatrically unveiled in open court. Bondi remained upright, composed, her tone unshaken. "Your Honor, we submitted our concerns through official channels on 3 separate occasions over the past 4 months. Each filing vanished without trace. After the 3rd disappearance, we had no recourse but to bring this evidence forward in a public forum, where it could not be erased." She gestured toward the court reporter, who continued her meticulous transcription, capturing not just testimony but the cadence of unraveling authority. "For the record," Bondi added, "copies of those previous submissions, including time-stamped delivery confirmations, are enclosed in Evidence Package B." At that, the lead prosecutor, Paul Cooper, a seasoned federal litigator with decades of courtroom gravity, stood slowly. "Your Honor, given the gravity of the material presented, the prosecution respectfully moves for an immediate recess to consult with the Department of Justice agents present." Chen's gaze shifted uneasily toward the rear of the courtroom, where the federal observers had not moved, but whose attention had never wavered. His voice faltered as he tried to respond, but Bondi was not yet finished. "With the court's permission," she said evenly, "I would also like to submit a detailed chronology of today's hearing, annotated with citations from the Judicial Code of Conduct, specifically those canons we believe Your Honor has violated over the course of these proceedings." Her co-counsel approached the bench with a binder, thick and meticulously tabbed. An electric stillness fell over the room. Even the most jaded reporters leaned forward, fingers momentarily frozen over their keyboards. "In addition," Bondi said, her tone cool and deliberate, "I would like to highlight discrepancies between Your Honor's rulings in this case and your decisions in similar matters previously argued before this court." With crisp precision, she began laying out examples, case by case, date by date, where arguments she had presented today were upheld when made by others. Her evidence revealed a clear and consistent deviation from judicial neutrality, a pattern that pointed unmistakably toward prejudice. As she continued, the color drained from Judge Chen's face. He realized now that this wasn't an ambush. It was a siege, one carefully planned, with a dossier that had been assembled over months of meticulous observation and strategy. The bias he thought he had concealed was now fully exposed, stripped of all legal pretense. "Miss Bondi," he said at last, his voice brittle, "this court will not tolerate baseless accusations against." "These accusations are anything but baseless, Your Honor," she said, sliding a final document toward the clerk. "This is a motion for your immediate recusal under 28 U.S.C. Section 455(a), which mandates that a judge must disqualify himself from any proceeding in which his impartiality might reasonably be questioned." At the back of the courtroom, the DOJ observer had stepped forward, standing directly in view of the bench. Several jurors turned to look at him, their interest no longer casual, but fixed. "And finally," Bondi concluded, unwavering, "we possess evidence suggesting that Your Honor's partiality has been influenced not only by matters of law but by external, undisclosed interests that have no place in a court of justice." With a subtle nod, Pam Bondi signaled her associate, who stepped forward and handed out sealed envelopes to the court clerk, the lead prosecutor, and the judge's own assistant. "These documents," she announced clearly, "contain records of undisclosed communications between Your Honor and individuals with vested interests in the verdict of this case, communications which, by law, should have been disclosed but were not." For the first time that day, Judge Edward Chen looked genuinely shaken. He reached for his water glass, but his hand betrayed him with a slight tremor. "This is highly unorthodox, Miss Bondi," he said, though the weight behind his words had withered. "As unorthodox," she replied, "as a sitting federal judge engaging in private conversations with witnesses slated to testify for the prosecution." A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Murmurs fluttered like startled birds. The lead prosecutor rose, visibly stunned. "Your Honor, the government was unaware of any such interactions." For a heartbeat, even the court reporter paused, her fingers hovering above the stenograph keyboard. Then she resumed, each keystroke now charged with the gravity of history in the making. Judge Chen's eyes flicked toward the exit, a reflex, barely perceptible, before returning to Bondi, who remained still, centered, and utterly composed. The courtroom dynamic had inverted completely. The authority that once radiated from the bench now pulled around her. "This court," Chen said, his voice brittle, "will recess for 15 minutes. Miss Bondi, you will provide full documentation when we return." When Chen reappeared, the transformation was unmistakable. The imperious confidence was gone. He carried himself now with the tightly wound restraint of someone bracing for impact. The gallery had swelled during the break, word of the dramatic developments had raced through the courthouse, drawing in staff, clerks, and even other judges. "Miss Bondi," he said with measured restraint, "you may proceed with your evidence." She stepped forward, joined by her co-counsel, who pushed a cart bearing 3 boxes marked Exhibit. "Thank you, Your Honor. With permission, I call to the stand Special Agent Kenneth Garcia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit." A man in a dark suit and calm demeanor rose from the rear and moved to the front of the courtroom. After being sworn in, he stated his name and title for the record. "Agent Rivera," Bondi began, "please inform the court regarding Investigation 23JC789 and its relevance to the present matter." He nodded solemnly. For nearly a year, the FBI has been investigating patterns of corruption involving federal judicial conduct in this district. As part of that probe, we obtained court-authorized surveillance of communications between Judge Edward Chen and parties with direct financial interest in several active cases, including the one currently before this court. The number of federal agents in the courtroom had increased. 5 now stood at intervals along the walls, silent, unmoving, their mere presence a palpable warning. The scales of justice had shifted, and their focus had turned. "I will give due consideration to these charges," Chen managed, summoning a sliver of authority. "But I remind all present, allegations are not equivalent to guilt. I reject the implication that I have acted improperly." Bondi's expression did not waver. "With respect, Your Honor, what we have presented are not mere accusations." "Agent Rivera, can you speak to the status of the materials entered into the record today?" Rivera straightened slightly. "All evidence submitted has been independently authenticated by the FBI's Forensic Division. The financial records were obtained through lawful subpoenas from institutions in 3 separate countries. The audio recordings have undergone forensic voice authentication and are confirmed to include Judge Chen and the named individuals." Judge Chen inhaled slowly, eyes narrowing as instinct and training took hold. He reached for the procedural tool that might offer temporary shelter. "This court will take a 30-minute recess. All evidence will remain with the clerk." As he stood, Bondi's voice rang out again. "Your Honor, in light of the allegations and the nature of the evidence, we respectfully request that federal marshals be assigned to secure the exhibits during recess to prevent any potential tampering." There was no mistaking her intent. She no longer trusted the judge with custody of the very proceedings he presided over. Chen froze mid-step, then nodded once, curtly. "So ordered." As the door to his chambers closed behind him, a low hum of whispered speculation rippled through the room. Bondi and her legal team leaned in for quiet discussion, their faces grave, though flickers of vindication glinted in their eyes. Across the courtroom, the prosecutors huddled with 2 DOJ officials, conferring in tense whispers. In the jury box, the last pretenses of detached observation had faded. Jurors now spoke openly among themselves, processing the gravity of what they had witnessed. One elderly juror, the same woman who had shaken her head earlier, caught Bondi's gaze and offered a slow, deliberate nod. Inside his private office, Judge Chen paced the confines like a man cornered by inevitability. His eyes flitted to the phone on his desk, hand hovering uncertainly. A knock at the door made him jump. "Judge Chen," came his assistant's voice. "There are 2 FBI agents here requesting to speak with you." He exhaled, shoulders collapsing slightly. "Show them in." Outside in the corridor, reporters clustered in frantic circles, dictating notes, capturing footage, and sending dispatches that had already begun echoing across the legal world. Security officers had cordoned off the hallway, corralling the swelling press corps and courthouse staff. What had begun as a high-profile trial was now something far greater, a reckoning. Pam Bondi stood slightly apart from the murmuring crowd, her phone pressed to one ear, her gaze steady and unreadable. To the untrained eye, her face was blank, but those who knew her well would have caught the subtle shift in her eyes, a glint of satisfaction, not boastful, but rooted in the quiet certainty of a long-laid plan coming to fruition with surgical precision. When the 30-minute recess stretched to 45 without any sign of Judge Chen, unease began to ripple through the courtroom. Federal agents who had remained watchful at the back now repositioned themselves near exits and flanked the door to the judge's chambers. The court clerk returned from a hushed hallway exchange looking pale and unsettled. At precisely 52 minutes past the recess announcement, the bailiff emerged. But instead of calling the court to order, he made a beeline for the Department of Justice delegation. A terse conversation followed. One of the agents nodded grimly, pulled out a phone, and stepped into the corridor to place a call. Bondi observed everything, every shift in body language, every glance, with the unshakable poise of someone who had anticipated the sequence down to the minute. When her co-counsel leaned in to whisper, she offered only the faintest shake of her head. Wait. 5 minutes later, the rear doors opened. A woman in a sharply cut charcoal gray suit entered, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. She moved with calm authority to the front of the courtroom, her identification badge swinging lightly from her lapel. Deputy Director Donna Howard, Department of Justice, Public Integrity Section. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, her voice silencing the room like a gavel strike, I am here to inform you that Judge Edward Chen is currently in federal custody, pending formal charges of judicial corruption, obstruction of justice, bribery, and racketeering under the RICO Act. Gasps, scattered cries, and the sudden scraping of chairs erupted throughout the chamber. Reporters bolted for the exits, some shouting into phones as they ran, desperate to break what had become the story of the year. Vasquez waited for the noise to subside before continuing. Furthermore, by directive of the Chief Judge of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, these proceedings are now suspended. The defendant's case will be reassigned, and a comprehensive audit of every case over which Judge Chen has presided in the last 5 years will be initiated immediately. She turned to the jury box, her tone respectful but resolute. You are formally released from duty, with the appreciation of the court. Some of you may be called upon again when these proceedings resume under new supervision. The jurors rose, filing out slowly, many casting glances toward Bondi, glances filled with something closer to admiration than neutrality. Vasquez then approached the defense table. Ms. Bondi, I understand your team has additional material relevant to our broader investigation. Bondi nodded once. Yes, Deputy Director. We've assembled records implicating misconduct in 17 prior cases. We'll provide full cooperation going forward. The lead prosecutor, Paul Cooper, joined them. His voice was heavy, but resolute. For the record, the prosecution had no prior knowledge of Judge Chen's actions. We will be initiating an internal review of all relevant proceedings to ensure the integrity of our office is preserved. Vasquez gave a brief nod of acknowledgement. Understood. For now, I recommend both legal teams prepare for a full restart once reassignment is finalized. At that moment, a sudden shift at the chamber door drew every eye. 2 U.S. Marshals stepped out, escorting Judge Edward Chen between them. The contrast was jarring. Gone was the commanding presence that had dominated the courtroom hours earlier. He now appeared diminished, his posture stooped, his expression hollow. His wrists were bound by gleaming handcuffs, the fluorescent lights above turning them into cruel jewelry. As Chen passed through the aisle toward the prisoner's exit, his eyes flicked briefly to Bondi's. In that flicker was a moment of realization, a silent admission that this downfall had not come by chance or coincidence, but by the quiet, relentless precision of the very woman he had once mocked and dismissed. Bondi did not return his gaze. Her features remained composed, her stance unchanged. Only a subtle straightening of her spine hinted at what she felt, not triumph, but vindication. A reckoning had been earned, and justice, long eclipsed, had begun to reassert itself. As Chen was led away, a court officer stepped forward with a document for Bondi's signature, an official acknowledgement of the case's suspension. As she signed, cameras flashed in rapid bursts, capturing the moment that would appear on screens, front pages, and legal journals across the nation. The courthouse, a structure accustomed to slow tides of justice, had witnessed an upheaval more seismic than any in recent memory. What began as a corruption trial had evolved into an exposure of rot at the very heart of the judicial system. And at the center of it all stood Pam Bondi, not merely victorious, but unshaken, a figure of resolute purpose. Outside, the courthouse steps had transformed into a full-blown media battleground. Satellite trucks formed a jagged row along the street, their dishes angled skyward like mechanical sunflowers. Reporters jostled and shouted, lenses clicked, and boom mics stretched over shoulders in anticipation. They didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes after the courtroom had fallen silent, the side entrance of the Savannah Federal Courthouse swung open. 2 U.S. Marshals stepped out, closely escorting Judge Edward Chen. Under the harsh southern sun, the steel cuffs securing his wrists caught the light, casting fractured reflections across the pale marble steps, tiny prisms dancing in cruel contrast to the weight of the moment. Chen's face was an open ledger of disbelief. The proud veneer that had once cloaked him in authority had cracked entirely. His once immaculate appearance had dissolved into disarray, his tie sat crooked at his collarbone, his dress shirt rumpled, and a thin film of sweat beaded along his temple despite the air-conditioned halls he had just left. The marshals guided him with quiet authority toward a waiting black SUV, shielding him from the barrage of shouted questions and the relentless strobe of camera flashes. Judge Chen, do you have a statement about the charges? Were other officials complicit in the scheme? Did you target Pam Bondi? Was this vendetta personal? But Chen offered no reply. The man who had begun the day cloaked in judicial arrogance, gleefully dismantling an opponent before an audience, now could not summon the will to lift his eyes to the crowd. His silence, once used as a weapon from the bench, now read as capitulation. As he was helped into the vehicle, a figure became visible behind the glass doors of the courthouse, Pam Bondi. She stood alone, still and watchful, her expression unreadable. Through the glare on the glass, she observed the vehicle depart, the crowd parting instinctively as it pulled away. Around her, the media frenzy swirled, journalists capturing every detail, down to the color of Chen's wrinkled suit, the make of the transport SUV, and the way the light struck the courthouse facade like the opening scene of a drama already destined for the history books. Bondi turned without comment and walked back inside. Her pace was even, deliberate. Her shoulders squared. She neither glanced at the reporters nor acknowledged the onlookers. Her presence needed no amplification. Inside, the building was alive with renewed purpose. Department of Justice officials worked methodically, coordinating with staff, preserving the chain of custody for evidence, arranging interviews, debriefing jurors. What had begun as a single corruption case had evolved into something far broader, an institutional reckoning. The machinery of justice, long trusted, briefly corrupted, now beginning to right itself, continued to turn. And at the center of it all stood a woman who had not yielded to pressure, who had stared down power with unshaken resolve, who had placed her faith not in outrage or spectacle but in the quiet force of preparation, truth, and law. Pam Bondi did not smile. She didn't have to.